Okay, can you see all that?
Absolutely. Yes. Perfect.
With a pointer to here? Okay.
Yep.
Um, Matthew, thank you very much for having Andy and me back. It's great that we didn't give a bad impression the first time, so we can come back twice. So really appreciate it. And so what we're going to do today is talk a little bit about what's in Volume 2. And for those who are seeing this for the first time, you can go to the YouTube video for Volume 1 elsewhere on your webpage. And we'll end with a little teaser of what might come up in Volume 3. And then maybe at the end, we can talk about or answer questions related to how we put this book together. So this set of books here, Volume 1 and 2, each one of these books only covers about 20 or so species. They're small books. It's a bit odd that there are only such few species in each book, but these really are some of the most challenging birds for identification in North America. And because of that, well, first, this had not been done before, at least at this scale. But they sort of each needed their own separate treatment. So Volume 1 was on the Impidinax and peewees, and Volume 2 is on Kingbirds and Myiarchus, and Andy's has illustrated these books so beautifully, and I think that's really what gives these books a lot of appeal. Let's see how this. So the books, on one hand, are similar to other types of field guides. You know, we go through each species and show field marks, but with flycatchers, one of the biggest challenges is that there's no single field mark that you can use to identify a bird. And to make matters worse, each field mark actually is quite variable. And so they overlap between species. And so for flycatchers, more than any other birds out there, you really have to approach the identification from a holistic perspective. And that's trying to bring in a whole bunch of different but variable field marks together. And it's that combination that is unique. And one of the challenges that we faced in putting this book together, or the first volume, was what if these field marks are so subtle, how do we actually train the eye, the birders to see this? And we didn't want this book to be just for experts. We really wanted to open the doors to beginners as well, even if they may not be that interested yet in the flycatchers, but perhaps by going through this, it helps them become a better birder in general and looking at all birds from a holistic perspective. And so here's just some short samples from Volume 1. And the first third of the book is dedicated to how do you see or hear or listen to a flycatcher. And the reason why we did that is that there are features in there where the structural features, like in here, the primary projection. This is how far the primaries extend beyond the secondaries, the tertials here. And everyone knows that flycatchers, you can identify them by, well, this one has a long one, this has a short one. But if you don't have a lot of experience, one person's long is different than the other person's long. And so we set these up as kind of rulers or guides for you. If you find a bird, you photograph it, open up that book, and then you just line it up with your photograph or your visual image in your head, and decide, is it short or is it long? And so we stressed a lot on these structural features. How long is the tail, for example, or is the bird big-headed or smaller headed? And the other thing we focused on was instead of color, if you've gone out looking at flycatchers, it can be a befuddling experience where, at first it looks green, and then the sunlight changes, and then it looks brown, and then it looks gray, and then you got three people there who all think the bird looks a different color to each of them. So we really de-emphasize color, and we focus more on color contrast or plumage contrast. And this is just one example illustrated by Andy here. For example, the wing bars, all the flycatchers, or at least the Empidonax, all have wing bars. And but this one right here, the yellow belly, has very strong contrast, almost bold white compared to the mantle. Whereas you go to one here, dusky and gray and willow types, their wing bars don't really pop out. They're almost the same color as the mantle. And so we call that low contrast. So we talk a lot about plumage contrasts in there. And after you go through that first part of the book, then you can go, you know what to kind of look for when you see a bird, and then you can focus on the species accounts. The other thing we focused a lot on was the seasonal status, the distribution. Where do these birds occur? What types of habitats are they in? But perhaps more importantly is when do you see them? When do they arrive? These are mostly insectivorous. They do eat some fruits. So they are very, very religious to when they arrive, particularly in the spring. So, you know, if you see a certain flycatcher in April in California, for example, and you think it's a willow, probably not. It's probably a peewee. Willows don't come into California until May, for example. So for Myiarchus and kingbirds, some of the same concepts, of course, translate in terms of how, you know, this holistic style of birding and identification. But there were enough differences that it didn't make sense for us to put this all in one book. And this is why we have the kingbirds and the Myiarchus in a separate volume. And what I'm going to go through now is the Myiarchus, and then when I'm done with that, Andy will come in and talk about the kingbirds. So in terms of Myiarchus, they're bigger flycatchers than the Empidonax. Their wing bars generally don't show so much of a difference between the species, but what does show up is, in this case, color. We didn't focus too much on color in the Empidonax, but in the case of Myiarchus, color is one of the indices, and this is just showing you a gradation of the really dull lasagras, which is out there in the Caribbean, all the way to the great crested, which we get out here in Texas, and then your birds are somewhere over here, sort of intermediate in color intensity. Again, though, we do focus on color contrast, and here the chest contrast become a very important feature to see, great crested, which I'm sure is a highly desired bird as a vagrant in California, as compared to more common ashtor. There's a very low chest contrast here. Again, similarities with Empidonax with plumage contrast. We do talk a bit about wing bar contrasts, where it exists or where it's important, but it's not that critical for all of them. But wing panel contrast can be useful also in separating some of the Myiarchus flycatchers. That is the pale edgings of the secondaries compared to the pale edgings of the primaries, and then all the Myiarchus have kind of rufous edges to the primaries, but it's their secondaries that can be really white, or they can be rufous, so less contrast, or they can be somewhat intermediate and gradational. And one unique thing about the Myiarchus is their tail patterns, particularly their undertail patterns. They're all rufous or varying extensive rufous, but they have brown outer margins, and the shape of these, the extent of the shape of these brown outer margins, whether they hook below or continue down straight all the way to the end, but without hooking, those can potentially be diagnostic if you can actually see it from below. And now today, with such good cameras or access to good cameras, a lot of these features you can capture fairly conveniently out in the field. And here, just showing you some skins. These, so the guides, both of them are completely based on illustrations, and Andy can touch on that at the very end, why we went through illustrations. In volume 3, we're going to have photographs, but For the talk, we'll show some photographs, and these are just skins of Myiarchus, and here I've lined them up in terms of size. And you can see from brown crested all the way down to the dusky capped, which is also a vagrant that you get sometimes up in Northern California. Look at the extreme differences in size. Even ash-throated is bigger than the dusky capped. And the shapes of the birds are slightly different. So we talk a lot about body size and shape in Myiarchus, and which is less of an issue in the Empidonax flycatchers. And then this one, I lined them up in terms of coloration. So you go from the more intense yellow here all the way down to the pale ash-throated and Lysagras that we have here. And here they are on the sides for comparison as well. As in for Empidonax, vocalizations are very important. Now with Merlin is actually quite good at identifying flycatchers by audio. So you should, when you see a bird, always try to record the bird, and maybe Merlin will answer it for you right there. But if it doesn't, at least you've got the recording, and one can actually always go back and look at it there. So I won't spend too much time on audios in this talk, but we have charts in there that try to simplify these vocals so that you can remember them or categorize them into different types. There are these weeps, there's these whits and pips, and we basically say who has what, right? So Nuttings doesn't have a pip, or a bird that has more of a liquid whit, whereas ash-throated has a pip for a call, and try to put it all there together as a cheat sheet for you. So the whole point of these both books is to try to make something that seems so difficult a little bit easier to digest. So what I'm going to do now is just go through a few of the flycatchers, just to give you a hint of what's in them. Ash-throated is the most, it was the only really regular Myiarchus in your area. And they are a relatively pale looking bird with very low contrast between the pale gray chest and the very light lemon yellow undersides. They have a strong wing bar contrast. They tend to be somewhat slender here. They were primarily a spring bird, and then move out in the fall and head back down to Mexico and the desert Southwest. But you do have occasionally a few that winter in Southern California. They have probably the most distinctive of all under tail coverts, the brown outer margin to the tail. Comes down and then it hooks at the tip and makes this kind of continuous brown terminal band at the end of the tail. And these things really can't see from above, as Andy has illustrated here. You got to look at the bird from below. So here's some photos just to show you some of those features. And of course, here the call is, it has a pip or a quick call, and they have a chakir, very distinctive chakir call, almost like a referee's whistle. But here you can see the low contrast between the chest and the undersides, and then this beautiful hooking of the brown outer margins going all the way across at the end, the tip of the tail. Strong contrast between the primary rufous panel and the secondaries, which are white here, and then overall pale, low contrast with the wing bars. Not, I guess I would say medium contrast with the wing bars. The other bird of the West that is of interest is the brown-crested flycatcher. And these are probably pretty rare where you are. I'm sure you'd get very excited up there. They get into Southern California, but they're really a Mojave Desert bird and almost never even get to the coast in Southern California. But every year there may be one or two that make it to the coast, and occasionally up as far as you are. There are two subspecies. The one, fortunately, that you have to worry about, thankfully, is a big bird and has a very heavy bill. uh, making it structurally quite different than an ash-throated flycatcher. And it also is a little brighter in yellow and a little bit more contrasty on the chest. It has the strong wing panel contrast, so in that sense, that part's quite similar to ash-throated. But if you get a good view of the undertail, you'll see those brown outer margins, they don't hook around, so the rufous central part continues all the way to the end right here. And you can see that some of those features here. You see how the brown outer margins, they just go straight down to the edge and do not hook around, hook inwards. This is a nice spread tail here. It's a bit more yellow than an ash-throated flycatcher. And certainly you can see that the bill is very, very heavy. And if you get the right light, it actually does have a hint of a brown crest, hence its name. But sometimes that's actually quite hard to see if you have too much sunlight. It's just kind of everything's just faded out. So I don't typically use that as a feature, but big head, big bill, the brighter contrast and the brighter yellow underparts are important. They have distinct calls from ash-throated. They have a whip call as opposed to, and they have these short chortles here, and as opposed to sort of the referee type whistle call of the ash-throated. Now, great crested, that of course is not a bird you normally expect out here, but in the fall, they do vagrate out to the Pacific coast on a regular basis. And so stumbling upon one of these in California is always exciting. I remember stumbling upon them when I was birding in my earlier years in California. And so what you want to look for in these, for a great crested, is something that's really bright with a very strong contrast between the upper parts and the underparts. Often the chest is almost a dark gray, and then the underparts are even more yellow than many brown crested. So it's a very striking bird. The wing bars tend to be very bright, and so are the pale edges to the secondaries, particularly the tertial edge right here. Here's one that Andy has drawn from the rear. They can see this really bright white tertial edge that contrasts with everything else. So bright wing bars, bright tertial edges. And this is the only flycatcher or Myiarchus whose mantle has a greenish tint to it. It's a very subtle feature, and sometimes I notice that some people can't see that. Andy and I are able to see that, so I don't know if it's something that can be seen by all, but if you see it, you can be pretty sure you've got a great crested. The other features are they often have a pale base to the bill, not always, but it's a really distinctive feature, and it's got a dark face, and often there's some pale edging just at the rear of the eye, almost like an eye ring, but it's like a half of an eye ring or just a fraction of an eye ring, but it's always there. The other flycatchers, you don't see that too much because their faces are so pale. So here you go. They have this very distinct rising weep call, and they can be quite vocal, and we can, out here in the east, we can hear them half a mile away sometimes in the forest from their calls. But here, look how bright the yellow is. Look how strong the contrast between the chest and the underparts are. Here's that white half eye ring or quarter eye ring that I was telling you about, the pale base of the bill. I forgot to mention the tail doesn't hook either. The brown outer margins don't hook. So like brown crested, although there are little subtle differences relative to brown crested, but very different from ash throated. And then one other thing that we normally don't focus on in the Myiarchus is the primary projection, because they all tend to have similar primary projections or subtly different. But the great crested actually has the longest primary projection of all the Myiarchus. which you can see here if you were to compare it to the other Myiarchus. And it is the most long distance migrant of the Myiarchus, so not a surprise it has long primaries. Dusky cat flycatcher is one of my favorites. They really are a Mexican, Central American bird, but in the spring, they wander up to southeastern Arizona and also Texas, and they breed up in the mountains, the foothills in those regions. But then in the fall, although most will go back, for some reason, they will wander. And mostly it's the juveniles. They can wander pretty regular along the Southern California coast up into San Francisco, and then occasionally even as far north as Washington, very rarely though up there. But the most distinctive features of these is you got a small Myiarchus. It's the smallest one, very slender, and it has very low contrast wing bars. You can barely see the wing bars there. The tertials tend to be rufous edge too, so there's very low wing panel contrast, low wing bar contrast. As its name suggests, it has a dusky cap, but it's a really dark cap, cap and face that actually contrasts with the throat, which is gray, and the gray throat then contrasts with the yellow underparts here. They tend to be like a dirty yellow for the dusky caps, and they have a mournful call, this a pew type of call. And then finally, the tail is quite distinctive. This one has very limited rufous in it and will often appear all dark unless it spreads its tail completely. So here are some features of pictures here. You see the very dark tail here. This one is kind of washed out here, but you can see the contrast is not as strong here, but you can see the dark cap here. They have a slender bill. Of all the Myiarchus, it has the most slender bill, and then low wing panel contrast, and you can barely see any hints of any pale edges for the wing bars here. And then finally, for Myiarchus, the Nutting's flycatcher, which there are only a handful of records, I guess, for California, but they vagrate into the desert Southwest. They've even bred in Arizona. We get them occasionally in Texas. I suspect they may be more, well, they're going to be rare, but I suspect they may be less rare than we think. And the reason is that these are tough identifications, the Nutting's flycatcher. The way I look at them is that they seem to be something in between an ash-throated and a dusky capped. And usually when someone finds one of these, they get confused. They first, actually, if anything, they may call it a dusky cap, but they're not exactly happy with their ID. That's the first sign that you might want to look more carefully. So they're more confused, I think, at least with dusky cap and sometimes with ash-throated. So kind of an intermediate wing panel contrast. They have rufous in the tails, and the tail pattern looks a little bit like ash-throated, although it doesn't hook around as much, but it certainly hooks around more than, say, a gray-crested or brown-crested. And it tends to have a cute appearance, a rounded crown. The ones I've seen always seem to have a rounded crown. They tend to be more contrasty than ash-throated, maybe less contrasty than a dusky cat. They tend to be vocal, and when they open their mouths, you can actually see the color of their mouth lining, and you might think, how could I ever see that? But surprisingly, they open their mouths a lot, the Nuttings, and it has an orange as opposed to a pink mouth lining. And so here are some examples. These are from Texas. You can see not much hooking that goes around, but it does broaden towards the tip, this brown outer margin. Certainly more contrasty, a brighter yellow than ash-throated, almost, again, looking more like a dusky cat, but too much rufous in the tail for a dusky cat. they have a rising weep call, like a great crested. So if you're familiar with that call, if you lived out in the East and you hear one of these out in California, especially if you're out in the desert, they like kind of scrubby habitats. You should pay close attention and seek out that bird. Here are some more photos, one from Costa Rica and some from Texas. But here, look at that very round, big-headed appearance. Here you can see it hooks just a little bit, the brown outer margin, relatively strong wing panel contrast, uh, brighter wing bar contrast than the dusky cap. So basically, it's intermediate between dusky capped and ash-throated. And here, I think this is my last slide for the Myiarchus. Uh, they give this weep call, and every time they do that weep call, they just open their mouths wide, and you can see this. It's orange here, and here's a ash-throated. I've taken so many photos of ash-throated, and probably only a few percent of them have open mouths. But when I take photos of nuttings, it's like a good 20% of them have open mouths, and so you can see here this is pink, and this is orange, and overall a more elegant, contrasty bird than ash-throated. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn it over to Andy, and the kingbirds kind of deserve their own treatments in how to look at them, and that's why we separated them. So Andy, I'll let you take it away now.
Thank you. After spending years illustrating gray-brown birds with no color, it was quite nice to crack open, some color on some of these birds. And obviously, the kingbirds are the most colorful bunch in this group. And so, again, a bit like the Myiarchus, we look at color, although the yellows are much more, intense and vibrant on kingbirds. And I think, we all have quite a lot of experience with, cassins and western kingbirds and maybe the occasional tropical. So we get to experience that. So in this group here with the kingbirds, we look at body color, because obviously it's quite simple between a black and white bird like an eastern kingbird or even a thick-billed kingbird is largely sort of dark and whites with little bits of yellow on it versus our familiar cassins, westerns, tropicals, etc., which have loads of color. And then shape and structure is super easy sometimes with these birds. Thick-billed obviously has a very distinctive shape, huge bill. Loggerhead kingbird, which we won't dwell on because you'll never ever get one of those out in California, I'm sure, but again, a distinctive shape. And in a more subtle way, birds like tropical that you can get out here as as a vagrant in the winter, is a bigger billed bird, longer fork tail, etc., which will help maybe pick one out at a distance. Let's go to the next slide. We look at head contrast. I think, many people will be familiar with the difference between cassins and western. There's quite a bit of contrast on the cassins. Tail pattern is also very distinctive. Again, it's quite nice to get into more distinctive differences rather than these fine, subtle margins we've been dealing with Empidonax and Myiarchus. But, it ranges from the white-tipped black and white tail of eastern through to those white edges on the outer web of the outer tail feathers of western. And then we also have sort of more plain-tailed birds like tropical and cassins. And primary projection is actually really important also in this group. Unlike the Myiarchus, it's useful like the Empidonax. And sometimes, we can get a kingbird and we might not be too sure if we're looking at a tropical or perhaps an out of season western or even a cassins. And primary projection here, is something you can see quite well and is very distinctive. Western kingbird has these big, long sort of saber-like primaries compared to tropical. And that's something that could maybe really help you with an ID. The other thing that's interesting to note about this group is that the outer primaries, visibly have these notches in them on adult males. And, I think we'll see some of those examples in the group here, but, that is a difference between sexes there. And also between, young birds that don't have these deep notches. And you can often see these, they're quite visible when the birds are flying. And I think we mentioned at the beginning of this webinar that, the access now to be able to take great photographs of a lot of these species is really sort of allowing people to see details that maybe we weren't really appreciating before. One caveat, though, is obviously just like the Empidonax, birds can sort of droop their wings when they rest, and it can make primaries look longer than they really are. So that's always a caveat that applies to this group, just like the Empids. All right. We thought it was helpful in this book, because the yellow-bellied kingbirds can be very, very similar, particularly when we get into talking about things like tropical and couches. That we sort of line them all up together. One of the luxuries, you have with doing a small guide with a small number of species versus a field guide to, say, the birds of North America, where you've got to fit 800 species in. We actually have the luxury of filling up our pages if we need to. And so we have a lot of these comparison plates that hopefully, give people a chance to compare several species all in one go. Again, with sort of arrows pointing out the interesting things to be looking for. So here, we have what might look like a whole bunch of very similar looking yellow-bellied birds. They are, but there are also sort of subtle differences here. And there are subtle differences in the bill size and shape of couches versus tropical. There are subtle differences in the bright yellow breast of a couches versus tropical. And there are also differences in sort of the pale edging on the coverts of, say, Cassin's kingbird versus Western. And also, obviously, you can see there's, differences in bill size and shape between, say, Western and tropical and Cassin's and tropical. Often our views of these kingbirds are from below. We don't always have them nicely lined up perched on a wire at head height. Often they're above us. And there are still useful clues there in terms of being able to look at sort of brighter yellow chest of couches versus the tropicals, duller, greener chest. And we can compare that to the paler yellows of Western and Cassins. And then we can see there's differences in the undertails there. Obviously, we've got the forked tails of couches and tropical that have no color on them other than, contrasting color versus Western and Cassins. Western has this sort of jet black tail with white outer webs to the outer tail feathers, and Cassins generally will often show sort of pale tips to a dark brown tail. As we get into the species, there are obviously some warnings about some of this, but these are sort of generalizations. And then here is sort of lineup of like how those primary projections will differ between these species. There are subtle differences, not necessarily diagnostic in a field context, but there are subtle differences between couches and tropical. But there certainly are also very, I would consider, diagnostic differences then between Western and Cassins and Western and tropical. Sometimes our view of these things is in flight. And you can actually see, there's quite a lot of great photos people take now of flying birds, and you can actually see subtle differences in the primary structure in terms of shorter outer primaries on Cassins versus Western, and slightly very subtle differences in wing shapes between couches and tropical. Not something I would necessarily use to make a diagnostic idea of what might be, I don't know, the third state record of a couches, but it could be something that might be useful as supporting. Let's go on to the next slide. Here's a little more detail on some of those. We have Bear Divide here in the Angeles National Forest, where we get fantastic numbers of birds flying through, and we're often, they don't stop, they just fly over. So there's a lot of instances of flyover kingbirds. And I think, people are getting good photos of them in flight, and you can actually see sort of subtle differences in the wing structure of Western and Cassins in those photos. And here we just sort of highlight some of those differences. Yeah, it's okay. We can go to the next slide. We highlight some of those sort of differences here. Notice those long, thin primaries of the Western here. that more pointed wing shape, versus Cassin's, which has a longer P5, a primary 5. We always count our primaries basically from the outside primary going in. And we can, you know, in clear photos like this, we can count and see there's a slight subtle difference there. You know, this is where it may be quite useful, because you could look at that photo of a Cassin's and you go, wow, look at the white outer tail feathers on that. That has to be a Western. That is actually just the sun shining through. You do have to be aware that Cassin's will often show pale, what may appear to be pale outer tail feathers. And often they don't actually have the same definition and delineation as you can see there on the Western, a very neat, sharp line, which is this white outer web. Whereas this Cassin's here, we actually have the sun shining through it, making it look like it has white outer tail feathers, but it doesn't. It also shows that it does have a white tip tail. But you know, the primary structure there helps us get to the right ID, along with some other features there. You can see the darker gray chest of that Cassin's. It tends to be a bit more contrasting on the head than a Western that tends to be a sort of paler, grayer breast and face. Let's go on to the next one. So here's Western Kingbird, which we all know. I think, you know, Matthew mentioned you might have one still up there. I actually have one locally here as well. It's getting very late. You know, I sometimes will get them late October, early November, and even then that kind of turns my head. But we actually have one, you know, just of last week, we have one here as well. So that's definitely very unusual. And obviously something we should all be keeping an eye on if we're getting later and later records of some of these birds. I don't know if it's observer coverage or a change in you know, climate and temperatures. I guess we'll have to see. But, you know, here's some of the sort of key features we've already sort of touched on here. You know, there's white outer web to the outer tail, very sort of pale, sort of grayish head, often quite bright bird. They tend to have very plain wings. They don't have a lot of pale edges to the coverts that we'll see, you know, on the Cassin's. And in terms of migration here, you know, you know, we said it on the Empidanax, and you know, we'll say it again here. You know, status and distribution can be our best friend. It can be as important, perhaps even more important than the plates in terms of making your identifications. You know, certainly we don't expect to see a Western, you know, late at this time of year, so that can maybe help you with your ID. And we do have to be careful. Young birds can show quite pale coverts, just like a Cassin. So again, it's holistic birding. We're not using just one ID feature. An important thing to note on Western is generally sort of the whitish chin extends beyond the eye, which we'll see on Cassins. It tends to stop at the eye. And, you know, they have a chattering, twittering call as well, which is different from Cassins. Let's go on to some photos kind of showing those key features. See those white outer webs. It's a very clear, clean delineation between the white and the rest of the tail feathers. Notice the sort of a plain wings on that bird on the left there. There's not a lot of pale edges on the coverts, and quite a nice bright yellow. They're fairly colorful bird, I find, in terms of a brighter yellow than Cassins tends to be a bit of a duller yellow color. Let's go on. Cassin's kingbird, very dark, contrasting face pattern. You can see the white on the face there sort of doesn't usually extend much beyond the eye. It usually ends around there. The yellow tends to be a little bit duller on the underparts, and you'll see these sort of pale edges to the coverts. At the bottom, we illustrate a sort of warning here, you know, and I probably could have pushed that further. I sometimes see birds that are more extreme than this, but on the undertails, you can find Cassins with quite pale outer tail feathers. And, you know, that's just sort of generally wear. So worn birds, you know, you should look out for those and be careful when making that identification from a bird that you might be seeing from below. They'll often show fairly pale tips to the tail feathers as well. And one thing we've illustrated on this page, which, you know, I think, you know, we don't often get a chance to see, very, very occasionally I do, is that these kingbirds have these little hidden red patches of feathers on the crown. You know, you'll see them when they're getting agitated or puffing up their head a lot. Sometimes you see it. Very, very rarely do I see it though, but it is something that's there. And can be seen on, you know, eastern, you know, all of them sort of seem to have these hidden feathers that they can puff out and show. Let's go on to the next. Here's some cassins. You know, one thing we've got illustrated here is these long primary projection that we've got going on. You know, it's illustrated on that photo at the bottom. And then in the other photos here, we can see that sort of white chin that sort of extends basically to the eye. It doesn't extend not much beyond that versus Western kingbirds. There's a little more contrast there. You can see that bird on the right actually shows quite well those notched primaries we were talking about, those big notches there. So, you know, that's an interesting feature, as well as the bird in flight as well. Not unique to cassins, but you know, it shows that the notched primaries that these tyrannas can show. Let's go on to the next one. And they have a very sort of squeaky call that is very distinctive compared to Western. Here's a nice side-by-side comparison. Notice the pale edging on the cassin's coverts on its wing feathers there versus the Western. The Western showing that very black tail with the very nice, neat white edge. And then the face pattern there is also quite interesting, unique in terms of the white extending beyond the eye versus not extending beyond the eye on cassins there. You can see some long primaries here. So you can see that long primary on the cassins. Look at the long primaries on that Western. Very long, not something you would see on a candidate tropical kingbird if you were looking for one of those. Let's go on. And here is tropical, you know, a bird that will often visit the California coast, you know, in fall and winter. Sometimes birds will winter. Call is a fantastic way to pick these things up. They have this sort of insect-like twittering call, you know, quite unlike any of our familiar kingbirds that we have out here. And then hopefully you can spot it, and you'll look for a bird that has quite a long, heavyish bill, maybe quite bright below, bright yellow, might have a bit of a dingy chest, might be a little more greenish on the back, generally a little more colorful. It won't have any white in the tail, and it will generally often have a fairly forked tail. And then, you know, again, if you're a little unsure whether you're looking at a tropical or a Western, look how short those primaries are. Okay, let's go on to the next. Some photos. The one in the middle there, which Cin-Ty has a pointer on, really shows that big, heavy bill. That's a winter bird from California. You know, that bill is outside of the range of anything you'd see on a Western or a cassins. We got some photographic illustrations of the primary structure that can be sometimes seen on these species in flight. That, you know, you can, if you get good flight photos, can maybe be something you can come and study later at home to sort of see how it fits. And there's a bird on the right from Texas. You know, it shows quite bright yellow underparts, you know, really quite much brighter than anything you'd see really on a Western or certainly a cassins. But the chest can be quite dingy green. And they all show fork tails here. You know, the one on the right looks like it might be showing some pale outer tail feathers, but that's really, you know, not anything other than the light is shining through those. So don't be fooled by that. Let's go on. And then couches, which, you know, obviously exceptionally rare in California. There's really not been very many records at all. Again, it's a bird, if it was going to show up in your area, it would be wintertime. You know, definitely want to record it. Vocalizations are hugely important here. Very, very similar to tropical. So not an identification to be taken lightly. In general, they tend to have a slightly shorter bill, a slightly more conical bill. They tend to be much brighter yellow on the breast, lacking that sort of dingy green that the tropical will have. They'll also have a short primary projection and a forked tail. And call will be absolutely critical to helping to solve an identification issue with this bird. They do wander all over the place. You know, on the map here, you can see the vagrants all over. you know, the lower 48, very rare full vagrant, but they do regularly wander. Okay. There's some photos here just highlighting some of those features. Very bright yellow chest, shorter, more conical bill in general. In flight, you know, there may be some sort of subtle primary structure differences that you might be able to capture on a flying bird, in terms of, you know, seeing where primary 5 falls in relation to primary 6 and 7. You know, there are some very subtle differences that might be visible in some flight shots that you can get. But call being, you know, very, very important. Let's go on. Here's a comparison of the two. See the big long-billed tropical versus couches, brighter yellow underparts, all have a forked tail. And both have pretty short primary projections. Let's go on to the next one. Thick-billed kingbird. We actually have one of these that's wintering in my local Griffith Park. I love them. They make a fantastic noise. They are also another rare vagrant to the California coast. They make this very distinctive, loud chewie call. Very, very striking bird. Difficult really to confuse with anything else. You know, they're largely sort of dark and white kingbird. They can get very yellow on the underparts. That's something to be aware of. But in terms of shape and structure and call, they're a super distinctive bird. Okay. There's some photos just illustrating that. Some birds from Arizona in the spring and the summer. Very worn-looking bird there in August, in the middle of its molt. And then a California bird, very yellow below on the left there. And then a spectrogram there, just sort of showing, you know, how those calls will look. You know, if you ever, you know, Cin-Ty mentioned recording things on Merlin, if you ever record things on Merlin, obviously save the recording. But, you know, one of the things is we can be very visual with the audio now. You know, you actually look at what Merlin's recording and you can see the calls as a visual representation, and you'll see these shapes, and pips will look like this and wits will look like that. And you'll actually be able to see these visuals. Which is why, you know, we tend to sort of highlight the spectrograms, because you can actually use the audio clues in a visual manner. Okay. Let's go on. Here's a side-by-side, just like we did for Myiarchus. It really kind of highlights how bright and vivid those tropical and couches are versus the cassins and the western that really look quite sort of dirty in comparison. And you can certainly see there on the couches how it's brighter on the chest versus the tropical. Slightly dingier on that tropical, but otherwise very, very similar. And you can see the cassins as this sort of dirty, sort of charcoal gray chest area and head on the side view. You can see a much more contrasting head on that cassins. All right, next. Trying to whiz through them, I know. Oh, and this, I think, you know, if we have like 30 seconds, we're not going to bore people with this stuff. It's kind of, you know, it's certainly something for the really advanced birders who might be interested in this stuff. You know, we have an article that's hoping to be published in Western Birds soon, in the coming months, hopefully, just as a follow-up, which Cin-Ty will just quickly talk about regarding trails flycatchers, and a potential new feature to help separate birds that are well photographed that might be silent, which, you know, hasn't been done before. So we're just going to give you a very quick peek at that.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. So just a quick peek, and this is actually will be this technical information will be in volume 3. And you know, Andy introduced you through the yellow-bellied kingbirds or tropical and couches, that you could actually look at the primary tip structures. So you've kind of already seen that. And we have recently gone into applying this to all the impedinacs. So basically, it's the spacing, the relative spacing between these primary tips that turns out to be actually unique to a number of the impedinacs, and it's almost like a code that you can use if you have the right photographs. And this is just a summary slide of from Andy, which is basically that difference between the P765 spacings from alder and willow, what you'll see is the 6-5 spacing here is longer than the spacing between 7 and 6 for willow, and then it's the reverse for alder. And you might be wondering, how could I ever see that? Well, since this is going to be on YouTube, I'll have this here anyway, so you can go back and look at it. We actually did all these measurements, and this is the data. You can see these two birds cluster different. These are willow and alders, and it's just almost impossible to identify if they're silent, so you've got to use their vocalizations. But it turns out through holistic approaches and using these primary tip spacings, you can get to a pretty darn good confidence identification. There's a whole bunch of indices here that you can use. I won't dwell on that. This is just here for the YouTube video for later. But I just want to show you here these differences. So here that you can actually see, and it turns out the separation between the two, so this is P6, is about where P6, 7 and 6-5 are equal, like halfway. So if you look at an alder, which is the one on the left, this segment is longer than this segment. And if you look at the willow, the 6-5, the one that's further in, that is longer than the more terminal segment, which would be 7 and 6. And you can see that. It's a very subtle thing, but since it's almost at unity, the separation, the human eye can see these slight differences. And of course, you'd want to take the photo and actually make the measurement, but you can get a hint of that right away. And here's two others. Here, this is an alder on the left and a willow on the right. And you can see the difference between these relative spacings. And this, if you're a bander, I think a lot of banders just give up with a lot of the flycatchers because it's hard to take those measurements, the birds moving around. And in the case of trails flycatchers, it's actually a very complicated formula that you have to solve out there. You don't have the time, you may not have taken all of the right measurements. But in this case, we've now figured out you just need to get your iPhone out, take a picture of the bird in the right profile, and then when you go home, you can make the measurement later. That reduces sort of the stress on the bird. Anyway, we have some photos here to compare. You can see here's some willows, one from California on the left and one from Nebraska on the right. The P6-5 spacing is relatively long compared to the 7-6 spacing. And then alder is the reverse. Here, this one is pretty obvious, and this one's a little bit hard to see, but you can still see that this segment is longer than here. So I think that was the teaser, and for volume 3. Volume 3 will, we did not include vermilion flycatcher and the phoebes in volume 1 and 2. They didn't really warrant their own book, but we want to bring them in. And so volume 3 will include volume 1 and 2, all the birds there, as well as all the other ones that we haven't covered. And we will go down to northern Mexico. There will be Andy's illustrations again, more illustrations, and it will be a lot of photographs in there. And then there will be a part there for bird banders, pretty much all the morphometrics of these birds. So it'll be a tome, but we hope it'll be a nice book. So thank you all for listening. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask us.